The snow fell heavier that year. It came early, as if the gods knew blood was about to spill in the north. In the heart of Winterfell, Lord Eddard Stark stood atop the ramparts, looking beyond the frozen walls. His face, stern yet tired, caught the wind as it carried with it a faint howl, not of wolves, but of something darker. Trouble brewed in the north, and it smelled like betrayal. Word had reached him in hushed tones. Roose Bolton of the Dreadfort had been gathering men. Not just his own bannermen, but others. Smaller houses, broken knights, and mercenaries from the eastern ports. Ned had sent a raven, then another. No reply. Roose's silence spoke louder than words. Maester Luwin had read the messages aloud during the council meeting. Ned's bannermen stirred restlessly. Lord Wyman Manderley of White Harbour had frowned deeply, his jowls quivering. "Roose has always been a cold man, my lord. He flays his enemies, and I fear. Now he sees you as one." Ned didn't want to believe it. They had fought together during Robert's rebellion. Roose had been distant, but loyal, or so it seemed. But something had changed. Maybe the peace of the realm had bored him. Or maybe it was envy buried under that pale, dead-eyed calm he always wore. Later that night, as Ned sat alone in the godswood, snow gathering on his cloak, Catelyn approached him quietly. "You think he'll come?" she asked. "I know he will," Ned said. "He's already on the move." Far to the east, in the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton stood in the great hall, lit only by a few torches. Shadows danced along the stone walls, where hooks still hung, some fresh blood staining them. He had received word that House Hornwood might bend the knee if he offered protection from the wildlings. His bastard Ramsay stood nearby, feeding pieces of dried meat to his hounds. "You think he knows?" Ramsay asked. "Ned Stark?" Roose said almost lazily. "Of course he knows. But he will not act until I make the first move." "Then why wait?" Ramsay grinned. Roose turned his pale eyes to his son. "Because I want the North to see that he drew the sword first. They must think Stark is the one who breaks peace. Then we crush him, and any fool who dares call himself Wolf." The plan was already in motion. Roose had promised lands and gold to House Serwyn. He had whispered lies into Lord Tallheart's ear. He'd even sent gold across the narrow sea, hiring sellswords who cared nothing for honor or oaths. But most importantly, he had sent men south, to quietly ensure that Robb Stark, Ned's heir, would never make it back home from the Vale. Back in Winterfell, Ned called his bannermen. Word of Bolton's movements had reached them, and the air was heavy with unease. Lords gathered in the great hall, their voices rising with tension. Some called for immediate war. Others warned that it could split the North in half. "I will not strike the first blow," Ned said, voice cold as steel. "But I will defend Winterfell and all the North if Roose dares march against his liege lord." Lord Greatjon Umber slammed his fist on the table. "Then let him come. We'll flay the flayer and hang his bastard from the walls." But there was one voice missing. House Carstar, old allies, hadn't answered the call. It was then Ned knew. Roose had already begun his poison. Division had crept into the north, like frost under a door. That night, Ned wrote a letter to Jon Arryn in King's Landing, requesting aid if the north turned bloody. He sealed it with wax, but something in his gut told him it would never reach its destination. In the cold hall of the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton gave the order, march. The North was at the edge of civil war, not from outsiders, but from within its own blood. Brother against brother, wolf against flayed man, and in the white silence of snowfall, the first boots began to march south. The snow had turned to a cruel, biting wind by the time the ravens returned to Winterfell. One after another, dark-feathered omens arrived, carrying grim messages. Roose Bolton had moved, not with words, but with steel. He had taken the holdfast of House Hornwood by force. Lady Danella Hornwood was missing, her people slaughtered or taken. Those who survived whispered of screams, dogs, and flayed skin. Ned Stark stood in the great hall of Winterfell, his face unreadable as Maester Luwin read the report aloud. The lords of the north had gathered once again, but this time the tension was sharp enough to cut. "He's declared himself?" Lord Wyman Manderley asked, his voice grave. "No," Ned replied. "But actions speak louder than banners. It wasn't just Hornwood. Rumors poured in from the east. House Tallheart had pulled its garrison from Torrens Square. House Serwyn's youngest son had been seen riding with Bolton men. There was even talk that the Karstarks, once Ned's most loyal bannermen, had sent envoys to Roose. "What does he want?" asked Sir Roderick Castle. "He hasn't claimed the North. He hasn't declared war. He simply strikes in the shadows. He wants to be provoked," Ned said darkly. "He wants me to be the first to shed northern blood. Then he'll cry out that I've betrayed the old ways, that I've turned against my own. And what will you do, Lord Stark?" Lord Greatjonumber's eyes burned with fury. "Sit here while he flays every house east of the Weeping Water?" "No," Ned said, standing tall. "I will not strike first. But I will not allow another northern house to fall. We ride at dawn." The next morning, the gates of Winterfell opened. Ned Stark rode out with 500 men, warriors of House Stark, Umber, Mormont, and Manderley. The direwolf banners rippled in the wind, flanked by spears and steel. Winter was coming, and so was war. They rode toward Castle Hornwood, not knowing what they'd find. On the 5th day, as they crossed the Wolf's Wood, a scout returned, pale and trembling. "There's bodies, my lord, skinned, hung from the trees like trophies." A warning. Ned closed his eyes briefly. He had fought in 2 wars, seen more death than most men. But this felt different. This was not war. This was cruelty, pure and deliberate. At the ruins of Castle Hornwood, they found no survivors. Only burnt halls, blood on stone, and the smell of rot. Lady Donella was gone. Her guards had been butchered. But etched into the stone wall of the keep was a single sigil, painted in blood, a flayed man. Arms up, screaming Roose Bolton's mark. Ned's jaw tightened. For the first time, his honor gave way to something colder. "We return to Winterfell," he said. "But send ravens to the northern lords." "All of them. Roose has made his move. Now we must answer." Meanwhile, deep in the Dreadfort, Roose sat quietly as a raven landed on his windowsill. He unrolled the parchment, read it, and placed it aside without a word. Ramsay stood beside him, sharpening a blade slowly. "They march?" Ramsay asked. "Yes," Rose murmured. "Ned has taken the bait. Should I take men to Torrens Square?" "Burn it to the ground?" "No," Roose said, rising from his seat. "Let him come. Let him gather his banners, wrap himself in honor, and march proudly to justice." He walked to a table where a large map of the north lay open. Red markers surrounded Winterfell. Blue ones, his own forces, flanked the east. "We will not fight where he chooses. We fight where we decide. We bleed him slowly, not with armies but with treachery." A cruel smile touched his lips. "Send word to the Karstarks. It's time they pick a side." Back in Winterfell, Ned returned with fire in his eyes. He looked at the faces of his children, Robb, Bran, Rickon, and knew that war would soon stain their future. Catelyn met him in the Godswood again. "I thought you said you wouldn't strike first," she said softly. "I didn't," he replied. "But the North has already been struck. I only choose whether to answer now or bury more innocents." He kissed her forehead. "Send Robb to White Harbor. He'll be safer under Wyman's protection. If I fall—" "No," she said, eyes shining with tears. "Don't say that. Don't curse it." But Ned Stark had seen enough war to know that no man walks into battle with certainty, and in the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton had already begun writing new letters, whispering false promises, sowing doubt. Some ravens carried gold, others carried lies. The North would bleed, and Roose would not need to lift his sword until it was already drowning in red. The air over the north had thickened, not just with snow, but with mistrust. What once had been a land bound by honor and ancient loyalty now trembled on the edge of betrayal. Ned Stark had returned to Winterfell, but peace no longer lived in its halls. From every corner of the north, ravens answered his call, but not all bore the replies he hoped for. House Glover of Deepwood Motte pledged support. House Mormont, fierce and unyielding, promised 50 warriors. "Every one of them worth 10 men, Lady Mage wrote. House Manderley sent grain and 3 ships filled with soldiers from White Harbor. But House Karstark remained silent. That silence was more dangerous than a sword at the throat. In the great hall, Ned stood by the hearth, flames licking the stone behind him. Robb had returned from White Harbor after insisting he would not sit idle while war came to Winterfell. He stood beside his father, tall and proud, with his mother's fire and his father's quiet strength. "We have 5,000 men, if we count the Umbers and the Manderleys," Robb said. Ned nodded. "Roose has less. But he won't fight clean." A raven screeched above, and Maester Luwin appeared with another scroll. "From Torrens Square, my lord." Ned took it. His eyes scanned the words. He did not blink. "They've pledged to Bolton." The hall fell silent. In the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton paced slowly through the cold stone corridors. His boots echoed on the floor like drum beats of an approaching storm. A servant kneeled before him, his hands shaking. "They say, Lord Stark has rallied half the north," the servant stammered. Roose only blinked slowly. "Good," he said. At the table, Ramsay leaned over the map, grinning like a dog ready to feast. "What now, father? We strike the Manderleys? The Umbers?" Roose didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a dagger and drove it into the center of Winterfell's carved likeness. "We don't attack yet," he murmured. "We break his soul first. We take what he loves." Ramsay's grin widened. "The boy?" Roose nodded once. "Send word to our friends in the south. Tell them it's time." That night, Ned's worst fears came true. A raven from Castle Black arrived in the dead of night. Jon Snow was gone, not deserted, not missing, taken. The message had come from Lord Commander Jorah Mormont himself. Jon had been lured out on a ranging mission, one organized by a Night's Watch brother who had vanished afterward. Their trail led south beyond the gift. "They used the watch," Ned said, voice low with anger. "Roose has no limits." Catelyn looked up at him. "Will you still not strike first?" "I strike now," Ned said. "And I strike hard." The next morning, banners rose again above Winterfell. Wolves howled across the white hills as the call to war sounded. Robb would command a smaller force and march north to Deepwood Motte. To secure the western flank, Ned, with his larger host, would march east, straight toward Torrens Square. Now in Bolton hands, the banners of House Stark, Manderley, and Umber marched together for the first time in nearly a generation, but they did not march toward glory. They marched toward a trap. At Torrens Square, the gates had been reinforced, and the Bolton sigil, the flayed man, now hung above the battlements. As Ned approached with his army, horns blared and drums thundered inside the keep. He raised his hand. "Hold." Sir Roderick Castle rode beside him. "If we siege it, we risk wasting weeks." "No," Ned said. "We send terms. One last chance. I'll not be remembered as the man who turned the north into ashes." But Roose had left nothing to chance. When the Stark envoy arrived at the gates of Torrens Square, the Bolton commander threw them a sack. It landed with a wet thud. Inside was a severed hand, a boy's hand. Attached to it was a strip of fur, black, with hints of grey, ghost's fur, Robb's direwolf. Ned Stark stared at it for a long time, and then he turned to his men. "Raise the siege towers. Prepare the rams." "But, my lord, it could be—" "I said prepare for war." The wolves of Winterfell had held back long enough. Now they would howl, and Roose Bolton, wherever he was hiding, would soon learn what happened when you touched a Stark's blood. Snow churned beneath the boots of 1,000 men as Ned Stark's host surrounded Torrens Square. The sun barely pierced the grey sky, casting a pale light over the siege towers and ballistae. A bitter wind howled through the trees, like ghosts of the old North crying out for justice. But for Lord Eddard Stark, justice had already died. Now only vengeance remained. The severed hand, pale, cold, small, haunted him. It might not have been Jon's, it could have been a trick. Roose Bolton was cunning enough to use anything, even a child's hand, to provoke war. But it had been wrapped in ghost's fur. That was no coincidence. "Let it be a lie," Ned whispered to himself, standing at the edge of his command tent. Let the boy still breathe. Inside the keep, the Bolton men watched the siege form around them. They laughed, drank, and dared the wolf to strike. These were not true northern men anymore. They were sellswords in Bolton colours, men loyal not to honour but to silver. Ned gave no speech. There was no glory here, no call to banners. Just the slow groan of siege towers rolling forward, the heavy clang of rams crashing into oak gates, and the rising sound of war. Torrens Square would not last long. Its walls were not built to withstand a true siege, and within 2 days the outer gate cracked. On the 3rd, fire was launched into the yard, and by dawn of the 4th, Stark soldiers poured through the breach like a flood. Ned entered last, his sword still sheathed. Inside the keep's hall, the Bolton commander lay dead, throat cut, his body surrounded by fallen Stark men. But there was no sign of Jon Snow, only more corpses. Some flayed, some children. Roose had never intended to defend Torrens Square. It was bait. At Deepwood Motte, Robb Stark rode hard through frozen forest trails, unaware of what was coming. With him rode 300 men, Mormont archers, Glover swordsmen, and a handful of northern scouts. Their task was to secure the western coast before Bolton could take it and cut off the Stark supply line. But on the 3rd night, under a crescent moon, Robb's scouts didn't return. He rode out with Grey Wind at his side to find them. What he found instead was blood, 10 men, throat-slit, arrows still sticking from their backs. Ambush. From the trees, arrows rained down. Grey Wind howled, charging forward, but the noise of battle had already exploded behind them. The Bolton trap had sprung. "They're behind us!" One of the Mormonts screamed as flaming arrows lit up the trees. Robb turned, drawing his sword, eyes darting through the smoke and fire. From behind the trees came Bolton men, not in full armor, but wearing the cloaks of slain Stark scouts. They'd walked into a slaughter field. Robb fought hard. Grey Wind tore into the enemy like a demon, snarling and ripping flesh, while Robb defended his men with a fury worthy of his father's blood. But there were too many. He ordered the retreat. Of the 300 that rode west, only 60 escaped. Robb's first taste of war was not glory. It was fire, blood, and failure. Back at Winterfell, Catelyn Stark received 2 ravens in the same day. The first told her that Torrens Square had fallen, and Ned still lived. The second, that Robb had been ambushed and was wounded. She fell to her knees in the solar, clutching both scrolls, her knuckles white. Bran and Rickon played quietly in the corner. They were too young to understand the cost of rebellion, the weight of names carved into stone, the finality of death. Catelyn rose slowly and went to the godswood. Beneath the heart tree, she knelt and whispered not to the old gods, not to the 7, but to any force that would listen. "Protect my sons. Keep my husband alive. Let this end before I lose all of them." Far from the chaos, in the dark halls of Carhold, Lord Rickard Karstark stood at his own war table. A Bolton raven rested nearby, unopened. His son Harrion stood at the door, arms crossed. "We owe them everything," Harrion said bitterly. "You rode with Ned Stark. You bled with him." "I did," Rickard replied. "Then why do you hesitate?" Rickard turned slowly. "Because I also buried 2 sons, and I buried them for a war that wasn't mine." "And what is this, then? Cowardice?" Rickard slapped his hand on the table. "This is survival." Outside, the snow kept falling. Silence returned, but war was coming to Carhold, whether it was welcomed or not. And in the shadows of the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton stood alone in a cold chamber. Across from him sat a man hooded and bruised, chained to the wall. His face swollen, lips split. Jon Snow. He didn't speak anymore, not since the second flaying. Roose hadn't taken skin, not yet. But pain had its own language. "You will watch your kin burn," Roose said softly. "And when Winterfell falls, I'll send your corpse back to your father. Not flayed, not broken, just empty." He stood and walked away. Behind him, Jon's eyes flickered and a whisper passed his lips. "She'll kill you." Snow was falling heavier now, thick enough to choke the sun and blanket the fields in a blinding white. Ned Stark rode east from Torrens Square, blood still drying on his armor and the dead still burning behind him. The siege was over. A hollow victory. Torrens Square had been taken, but the cost was rising, and Roose Bolton had slipped further into the shadows. Every mile they rode back toward Winterfell. The north looked less like home and more like something being carved apart from within. Villages once loyal to the Starks now flew no banners. Crops had been burned. In one hamlet near the last river, they found a young woman nailed to a tree, flayed, her mouth stitched shut. Above her, the Bolton sigil. Ned dismounted and knelt beside her. Sir Roderick stood behind him, silent, disturbed. She was with child, Ned whispered. He rose slowly, jaw clenched, eyes filled with quiet, deadly resolve. We ride to Winterfell without delay. Roose wants me chasing ghosts while he poisons the heart of the north. But what if he's already there? Sir Roderick asked. Ned didn't look back. Then we bury him beneath it. At Winterfell, the walls stood quiet but tense. Catelyn moved like a ghost through the halls, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights, her lips constantly whispering prayers. She barely ate, barely spoke. She had received no word from Robb in days. The wound in her heart grew with every passing hour. Bran had asked her the night before, "Will father win?" And she couldn't answer him, but the wind carried a sound that lifted her from her chair. Horns. Not warning horns, but welcome ones. The gates opened to the banners of the direwolf. Ned had returned. Catelyn ran down the steps just in time to see him dismount. His eyes found hers, and for the first time in weeks there was light between them. She ran to him and held him like a woman afraid of the gods stealing him away, but Ned whispered in her ear, "They have Jon." That night, the great hall filled with war again. Torches burned along the walls as the lords of the north gathered to speak freely. Robert Glover had arrived with fresh men from Deepwood. The Manderleys had doubled their commitment, but the Karstarks were still silent. "They will not come," Lord Greatjon roared. "Rickard Karstark is a traitor who hides behind old grief. If he won't ride for the Starks, then he rides for the Flayer." "Enough," Ned said calmly. "I'll not condemn a man until he raises arms against me." Sir Roderick leaned in. "Then you should see this, my lord." He handed Ned a piece of parchment, taken from a captured Bolton scout near the Wolfswood. The seal was broken, the contents burned in places, but the signature at the bottom remained, Rickard Karstark. The letter pledged 200 horse to Roose Bolton in exchange for autonomy and the return of certain ancestral lands. The great hall erupted. "He's chosen his side," shouted Lord Manderley. "Then let's ride to Carhold and burn the damned keep," yelled an Umber. But Ned raised his hand. "No, not yet." He looked to the fire, his voice steady. "I once fought beside Rickard Karstark. He buried his sons during the rebellion. He's not a cruel man, but he's a broken one. And broken men are dangerous," Catelyn said softly. The next day, Ned did something no one expected. He rode to Carhold, alone. No bannerman. No guards, just himself and a single raven circling above. When he arrived, he was met with swords at the gate. "You ride without men?" asked the captain. "I ride with my honor," Ned replied. The gates opened. Inside, Lord Rickard Karstark sat in a cold stone chamber before the hearth. He didn't rise when Ned entered. He didn't offer wine. "I thought you'd send an army, not yourself," Rickard muttered. "I came to look a man in the eye before deciding if he's my enemy." Rickard stared into the flames. "You know what I've lost, Ned. Harrion is all I have left. Then why risk losing him too?" Ned asked, voice low. "Because Roose offered what you never would. Peace." Ned stepped forward. "You call it peace? You know what he did at Hornwood. You know the flaying, the fear, the blood. That is the peace Roose Bolton gives." Rickard didn't answer. "Did you think he wouldn't come for you next?" Ned said, "When he's finished using your name, he'll skin your house from the inside." "You think I don't know that?" Rickard snapped, finally rising. "You think I made this choice because I wanted to?" He slammed his fist on the table. "I made it because I was tired of watching the North burn for wars I didn't start." Ned looked at him, sadness in his eyes. "Then help me end this one." Back at the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton stood before a table with scattered reports. The news from Torrens Square, the ambush at Deepwood, and now whispers that Ned had walked into Carhold alone. He didn't like unpredictability. He didn't like emotion, and Ned Stark had just defied both. Ramsay entered with a bloodied cloth in hand. "Jon Snow won't break," he said. "Even after the dogs tore into him." Roose didn't even look at it. "He doesn't need to. His death will be enough." He moved a black marker over the map and dropped it on Winterfell. In the dead of night, as the wolves howled beyond the walls, a raven reached. Ned in Carhold, the message was short. Robb has disappeared, ambushed, last seen crossing the Wolfswood. Ned closed the scroll with shaking hands. The north wasn't just bleeding now, it was dying. The wind over Winterfell screamed like a dying beast. The snow had hardened into sheets of ice, coating the castle walls in a pale crust. Fires burned day and night now, not just for warmth, but for hope, the kind that flickered easily and died faster with each raven that arrived. Robb Stark was missing. Not dead, not captured, just gone. Ned had returned from Carhold with Lord Rickard at his side, grim-faced, silent, guilt pressed into every wrinkle. The betrayal was not forgiven, but it was postponed. Rickard had pledged his men to House Stark once more, shamed by Rose's manipulation and his own desperation, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was. In the Great Hall, the Stark lords gathered again. This time, there were no raised voices. Only tired ones. How does a man vanish with 60 riders in the Wolfswood? Wyman Manderley grumbled, red-eyed. They were heading back to Winterfell, Sir Roderick said. He should have reached us by now. He's not dead, Ned said, standing at the high table. If Robb were dead, I'd feel it. Like something torn from my soul. Some lords exchanged glances. They didn't speak of the old magic, but they believed in it quietly. Stark blood ran deep, too deep for a father not to feel the death of his firstborn, but no feeling came. Still, the silence was heavier than grief. Beyond the Wolfswood, deep in the snow-choked hills west of the last river, Robb Stark awoke in a cave. His wounds were bandaged and grey wind lay beside him. Scarred and restless, he tried to stand. Pain lancing through his ribs, a figure appeared in the shadows. A woman, her face half covered in a grey hood, her voice low. Don't move too quickly. You'll reopen the cut, Robb blinked. Who are you? Someone who still believes in wolves. She was no lady. Her hands were calloused, her cloak stitched with patches of unknown symbols. Not a Bolton, not a Karstark, not even a bannerman, a wildling. Robb asked. No, just a northerner who remembers the real enemy. She poured a bitter-smelling tea and placed it near him. They were hunting you. 20 men wearing your sigil. My sigil? She nodded. Fake cloaks. Real knives. Meant to kill you in your own name, Robb's breath caught. He remembered it now. The ambush, the burning trees, the wolves howling, men wearing his colors striking from behind. Rose is preparing something, he said, voice raw. He doesn't just want to defeat us. He wants the North to believe it was us who burned it. The woman didn't reply. She only said, rest. You'll need your strength when you ride back. If you wait too long, you'll have no home to return to. At the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton stared into the flames of a brazier. Ramsay lounged nearby, humming as he cleaned blood from a bone knife. A scout approached, kneeling. My lord, word from Winterfell. Lord Karstark has returned to Stark's side. Rose didn't blink. Expected, and we've lost track of Robb Stark. He may still be alive. That made Rose pause. He turned to Ramsay. The boy's alive. That complicates things. I can find him, Ramsay said. I'll take the hounds. I'll rip the forest apart, one tree at a time. Roose shook his head slowly. No, let him crawl back. Let him limp into Winterfell with hope in his eyes. Let them celebrate. And when they do, he moved a black token over the map. We strike. Winterfell prepared for the storm. Ned Stark knew time was running out. Food stores were already strained. Supplies from White Harbor had slowed due to the early frost. Worse, he'd had to split his forces. One army in the east watching for Bolton movements, another positioned in the west in case Robb returned or more ambushes were launched. It was exactly what Rose wanted. Ned divided. A raven arrived at dusk. Its message was unsigned, short. Your son is alive. But so is your enemy, and he's inside your walls. Ned read it again and again. Inside your walls. He looked around Winterfell. The guards, the servants, the new riders from House Serwyn, who had arrived weeks ago, claiming neutrality but asking to serve. Was Rose already here? That night Ned called Sir Roderick, Maester Lewin and Lord Karstark. "We have spies inside the castle. Maybe more. What should we do?" Roderick asked. Ned's eyes darkened. "Shut the gates. No one enters. No one leaves. And if they flinch at the name Stark, put them to the sword." At dawn, Robb Stark returned. He rode with 20 men, half-starved, wounded, ragged, but alive. The gates opened for him, and grey wind leapt ahead, howling with joy. Catelyn fell to her knees at the sight of her son. Ned embraced him silent, his grip tight and trembling, but Robb didn't have time for relief. He whispered, "Father, we've been played. Bolton's not trying to win the North. He's trying to break it so badly no one remembers who ruled it first." He looked at the keep, then at the men standing watch. "Roose is coming, not as an enemy, but as a liberator." Ned turned to Maester Lewin. "Send ravens to every loyal house. The time for honor is done. The time for wolves to bare teeth has come." And somewhere, beyond the frozen rivers, Roose Bolton smiled. Not because he was winning, but because he knew he'd forced Eddard Stark to finally play his game. The snow fell in silence, blanketing Winterfell in a stillness that felt too unnatural, too calm. The walls stood tall, but something inside them had shifted. Honor had always ruled this castle, passed down like steel through generations of Stark men. But now even Ned Stark had begun to doubt the strength of oaths when knives crept in with smiling faces. Robb's return had brought hope, and with it fury. The North had nearly buried its future, and for what? Lies sown by a man who hid behind patience and poison, Roose Bolton. He had not sent an army to Winterfell. He didn't need to. He'd sent seeds, spies, false bannermen, corrupt servants. And those seeds had taken root. The purge began at night. Ned gathered the names, those who had arrived from House Serwyn without invitation, the rider from Torrhen's Square who never gave his name, the kitchen boy who had drawn maps of the Great Hall and slipped them to ravens. 20 men in total. Not all Bolton men, but all Bolton's tools. Sir Roderick led the sweep, quiet as a whisper. No trials, no speeches. Ned watched as the last of them, a bearded man who claimed to be a scribe, was dragged into the courtyard. "You served no house," Ned said to him. "Only your own fear," the man spat. "You're already dead, Stark. You just don't know it yet." Robb looked away. The man didn't scream when the sword fell, but Winterfell did. Because 2 hours later, just as the sun began to rise behind grey clouds, a rider approached the gates. Alone, hooded, calm. He carried a raven's black-feathered bundle tied to his saddle. He was let in, too easily, and when the bundle was opened in the courtyard, it revealed a sack of hands, human hands, dozens of them. Attached was a single scroll, sealed with flayed skin. "Your wolves howl, Lord Stark, but they forget. We hunt them one by one. Ask the Umbers where their scouts sleep now. Ask the Manderleys why their ships burn in the bay. You chased ghosts in the east, but you left the back door open." Roose Bolton, that very night, Winterfell exploded in fire. Not from outside, from within. The granary, the ravenry, and the eastern tower went up in flames within minutes. Screams echoed through the night as panicked soldiers scrambled to douse the flames. Then came the knives. Men who had served quietly for months suddenly turned. A Manderley guard slit the throat of his own commander. A cook tried to poison the Stark family's meal, only to be caught by Maester Lewin just in time. But the worst came at the main gates, where Bolton riders appeared in the smoke, not in numbers, but in precision. 24 elite killers on horseback, cloaked in grey, moved through the confusion like blades through water. Robb met them at the gates with 50 men, grey wind at his side. Steel rang on stone. Fire roared overhead. A Bolton rider charged Robb, only to be torn off his saddle mid-air by grey wind's bloody jaws. It wasn't war, it was butchery. Inside the great keep, Catelyn gathered Bran and Rickon, forcing them down into the crypts. She passed the carved statues of long-dead kings, of old Lyanna and Lord Rickard, as the sounds of burning and screams echoed above. She lit no torch. She knew the way by heart. They would be safe beneath the dead, if only for a while. Ned Stark fought in the snow with a fury that terrified even his own men. Not since the rebellion had they seen him like this, blade in hand, face like stone, striking with deadly purpose. He killed 4 that night, maybe more, but then he heard it, to scream, not from the walls, not from the soldiers, from the godswood. He ran. At the heart tree, beneath the weirwood's bloody eyes, a body hung from a branch. A child. Flayed. Still alive. Barely. Too small to be a soldier. Too small to be a threat. Ned dropped to his knees and cut the rope. The boy gasped in agony, skin hanging from his back like strips of parchment. Catelyn arrived moments later, eyes wide, mouth trembling. "Who is he?" she whispered. Ned turned the child's face gently. It was Tommy, one of the kitchen boys, 8 years old. Catelyn knelt and wrapped him in her cloak, sobbing. This was Rose's message. Not a siege, not a conquest, a warning. By morning the fires had been smothered. Bodies lay frozen in the courtyards, their blood steaming in the snow. Nearly 100 dead, dozens more wounded. A quarter of Winterfell's food reserves were gone. Half the ravens were burned alive. Robb stood at the battlements, fists clenched. They came inside the walls. Inside. They were always inside, Ned said behind him. This war will never end, will it? Ned didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked down at the snow-covered grounds of his home, and all he saw was ashes. Then he turned to Robb and said, "We strike at dawn. No more waiting, no more honor. We ride to the Dreadfort. And what if Roose is ready for us?" Ned looked toward the godswood, where the trees still whispered with the blood of the innocent. "Then we bury him there, in his own house, with no skin left to hide behind." The sky over the Dreadfort was black with storm. No snow fell, not tonight, only sleet cold and sharp, slicing the air like knives. The walls loomed as they always had, ancient, cruel, and stained with secrets. But tonight they trembled, because Winterfell was coming. Lord Roose Bolton stood at his tower window, robes draped over his pale frame, watching the horizon. In the distance, torches flickered like stars on the march. "They'll be here by dawn," he murmured. Ramsay stood beside him, hands bloodied from whatever entertainment he'd found in the kennels that night. "We should have burned the crypts," Ramsay muttered. "Bastards hide in bones." Rose didn't look at him. "I want Ned Stark broken, not just dead. Let him ride through fire and rot to reach me. Let him find what we've left behind." Ramsay grinned. "And what if he reaches you, father?" Roose finally turned. "Then let him learn why they called me the quiet wolf in my youth. Dawn broke in blood." Ned Stark stood before the Dreadfort's gates, his sword ice strapped across his back, the blade that had once taken heads in peace, now drawn for war. Beside him rode Robb, bandaged but unyielding. Behind them, the banners of House Stark, Karstark, Manderley, Umber, and Glover fluttered in the storm wind. The North had answered, not because they loved Ned, but because they feared Rose. "Burn the flayed man to the ground," Ned commanded. "We raise no banners but the dire wolf." And so they did. With a cry, the Stark host surged forward, siege towers rolling, arrows singing, battering rams slamming like thunder against the black gates of the Dreadfort. Bolton's men responded with fire and fury. Archers loosed volley after volley from the towers, boiling oil poured from the battlements, and the flayed man screamed from every banner. But it wasn't enough. The North had come to end something. Not conquer, not rule. To end. Robb led the first breach, crashing through the eastern wall after Manderley sappers collapsed part of the foundation. Grey wind leapt through fire and slaughter, ripping Bolton soldiers apart with wild fury. The boy who had once played with wooden swords now fought like a king born in shadow. On the western flank, the Karstarks avenged their shame. Rickard rode through the gates, his men chanting the names of the sons he'd lost. Not to Bolton, but to his own hesitation. Inside the walls, chaos reigned, and in the heart of it, Roose Bolton stood, still, waiting, silent. He did not flee. He did not shout. He stood in the great hall of the Dreadfort, as if expecting the wolf to come home. Ned Stark walked through the doors with ice drawn. He was soaked in blood, none of it his. His armor dented, his eyes wild. Roose turned. "It ends here," Ned said. Roose raised no weapon. "Then strike." "Become me." "I'm not you," Ned growled. "No," Roose said. "You're worse. I skinned men who crossed me. You skinned a kingdom trying to stay clean." Ned advanced. "I didn't start this war, Roose, but you let it grow," Roose replied. "You clung to honor while wolves were torn apart. You held your sword when the North needed fire. You let me in, Ned Stark." Ned swung, ice carved through air, and Roose Bolton fell. No scream, no last word, just silence, the quiet that follows when something monstrous dies. Outside, the Dreadfort fell. The last Bolton soldiers surrendered, or were hunted like dogs by Umber riders. Ramsay fled, but not far. Grey wind found him half a mile from the battlements. What was left of him didn't deserve burial. Robb stood atop the battlements as the dire wolf banners were raised again. This time no cheer followed, only a long, low howl from the hills. The war was over, but the North would never forget the price. 2 days later, Ned stood in the Godswood of Winterfell. The fires had been put out, the dead buried, the wounded tended to. He knelt beneath the heart tree and closed his eyes. The face in the bark seemed sad. "We won," he whispered. "But what did we keep?" That night, he visited Jon's room. The boy lay weak but alive, pale from weeks of torment. He had been rescued from the Dreadfort's dungeons, half-conscious, near death. "You came," Jon whispered. "I always would," Ned said, silence stretched. "You killed him?" Jon asked. Ned nodded once. "Good," Jon said, closing his eyes. "He had no right." "No," Ned replied softly. "He didn't." Weeks passed. The banners were lowered. The war songs ended. Winter returned to the North, but not as an enemy, as a reminder of what had been lost, of what had survived. Ned stood atop the walls of Winterfell one last time that season, watching the snows fall gently across the courtyard. Catelyn joined him, sliding her hand into his. "Is it over?" she asked. "No," Ned said, "but for now." "It's quiet,"